Listening to Neil, it reminds me of so many difficult ways to do a rather simple task. And it's a cinch with lack of support facilities. We have those resources. Do we have a moment?
Oh, sure.
Good. Well, I'll just take a break and tell you about my misfortunes too. I was of a generation following the World War II pilots, in which we had better airplanes and better training. So if I might just set the scene for you, in 1962, now that we just finished the 45th reunion of the airlines, in which the charter was a 7,000-mile charter throughout the Arctic with a single-engine otter, with the Chief Justice, John Sissons, of the Northwest Territories Supreme Court. The court had just moved from Peace River, and the court circuit in the NWT was reportedly the longest circuit court in the United Kingdom, including the Commonwealth, being served by a single otter. And I'll give you, if I may, a very quick thumbnail sketch of a typical trip. At that time, in '62, the only building at the airport was a small World War II weather Quonset hut. We had no SARA or ELTs. We had no GPS. It was all visual, and the charts were in yellow marked exploration details uncertain. That is, they were before the completion of the aerial survey maps. I look here today, and I know every one of these airplanes has a global positioning receiver. All of them have, part of them might have the latest flat screen technology, but in those days it was very visual. The flight left here with uncertain weather conditions, so I put on extra fuel at Fort Reliance. That was about 450 miles to go. Well, what had changed in my generation of pilots were better airplanes. The Beaver was built in 1947, the Single Otter in 1953. We were operating both. That gave us range. They also had fairly good instrumentation. So those of us that held instrument ratings had the ability to operate without concern as to our visibility at destination being reasonable, and we had a habit of flying on top, because most of the Mackenzie is fairly flat and it makes good emergency landing, so we're on top. My experience was out of Reliance, and I asked the judge, I said, Mr. Justice Sissons, my estimate is that we have at best a 50% chance. There's a warm front coming through the Keewatin. Would you like to move, sir, with the idea that we may spend a night on the ice? Being on Peace River in the days of horse and wagon, that didn't bother him at all. Much of the court party had nothing to say about it. Edward Tingley, Scotty Stewart, I'm speaking of the Crown prosecutor, the clerk of the court. When I was getting well into the Barrens, I was talking to Baker Lake. In those days, we knew everybody. I was talking to George Elliott, that had the beacon frequency in Baker Lake. And I was very certain I was somewhere close to being on track, because in those days, we didn't have gyro compasses, so we all had astro compasses in our cockpit to take shots of the moon. You take your Greenwich tables at 0 time Greenwich, subtract the longitude, come up with the local hour angle, put the compass on the sun, and you've got your true heading. We were also operating in the area of compass unreliability. The proximity to the North Pole was getting closer. The moment of force was more vertical than horizontal. Your alcohol-based compass would just sort of drift. In any event, you were very careful with your heading information. When George told me that the barometer had hit the bottom, and visibility had gone out to 0, I decided it was a good time to land. I followed good bush procedures. The procedure turn, saw that I was over a lake. I knew I was on a lake because you see the drifts compared to the land, which identified the shoreline. Well, to make a good story landing, by the time I was on final, it was a total whiteout, made the approach absolutely routine. So it was a mixture of improved airplanes, range, and better training for pilots. And all of us today that fly these airplanes have a history in pre-World War II, where they only flew to the next lake waiting for the weather, where in my generation we flew with the weather, but always on the improving side of the weather, never going against the weather. And I heard from Don and from Neil a couple of rules of thumb. And one of my rules of thumb is I did not leave until I was on the improving with the barometer rising and knowing that I was not flying into the weather. With that little story, it's not as much fun, but it's how it worked, and it's how we made a business of aviation.